Hi, everyone. I'm Casey from the investment team at the LegalTech Fund. Today on In Studio, I'm joined by Mike, CEO and co-founder of Contend Legal. Contend is on a mission to close one of the most persistent gaps in the legal system, which is access. The numbers tell a pretty compelling story. In the US, low-income Americans get professional legal help only for about 20% of the legal problems that they face. And in England and Wales, over 10 million people experienced a legal issue in the past 2 years and saw no help at all. So we know that this isn't a niche problem, that it's a strategic, kind of a structural failure. Michael and his co-founder Will, a lawyer and software engineer, built Contend to be the front door to legal help for everyday people. Platform uses AI to guide users through some of life's most stressful situations, things like unfair evictions, wrongful terminations, complex divorces, and more. Since launching in the UK in early 2024, over 200,000 people have used Contend to understand, navigate, and begin resolving their legal problems. So today we're going to get into what it actually takes to build consumer legal, how you solve the trust problem, how you think about regulation across jurisdictions, and what it means to build a business model around the people most underserved by the legal system today. Mike, great to have you with us in the studio. Let's start, if you don't mind, with the founding story. What did you see in legal tech that made you leave kind of a stable role to build this?
Yeah, thanks, Casey, and excited to be here. So my background prior to founding Contend was largely on the B2B side of legal tech. So I was on the leadership team at a Y Combinator-backed legal tech company called DraftWise, and I was seeing a lot of AI use cases being built in across a variety of different enterprise software use cases. So how can you make law firms more efficient? How can you make in-house legal teams more efficient? And I was always excited by the potential that AI had to not just improve how companies operate, but how can you put this in the hands of consumers and improve access to legal information? Casey, like you mentioned, it's a persistent and well-known issue across the legal sector and even in everyday life that getting legal help is not as easy as it could be, especially if you're in a legal area where you're not familiar with the relevant laws and regulations. And so with the amount of rapid technological growth that was happening with large language models, there was a really exciting opportunity to take my experience, take Will's experience as well, my co-founder, who, again, both a lawyer and software engineer, and build a team, a product, and a company that used AI to improve how normal people access the legal system. And it's exciting because it's not just a social opportunity, it's an enormous business opportunity as well. And the outcomes there are really correlated. You can build a generationally important company while also making the world a meaningfully better place. And so that intersection of untapped market, exciting opportunity with very new technology, and possibility for huge impact was really exciting to me.
And for people who haven't seen or used the platform yet, could you walk us through kind of what Contend does and what a user usually experiences when they work with you on a legal problem?
For sure. So it's worth using a standard large language model experience like a ChatGPT experience or a Claude experience as the baseline to work off of. But Contend is like taking that user experience and focusing it specifically on legal. So when someone starts speaking to Contend, it's modeled after a lawyer's intake process. So rather than either jumping to conclusions or prematurely recommending a plan, Contend collects a bunch of relevant information about the user's legal situation, whether it's in housing, employment, or another legal area that we cover. At a certain point in the conversation, once enough information has been gathered, Contend puts together what we call a legal action plan, a set of steps that it can walk the user through that it can meaningfully help with. Usually involves explaining their rights, putting together a document that could be helpful for their particular issue, and then, if necessary or appropriate, recommending them to other resources. All of that is put together as part of this multi-step plan that's generated based on the situation the user has put together. Once they reach that point, the user is able to review the plan, see what the actual steps in the process are. If they want to sign up for the premium paid version of Contend at that point, they can. And then we walk them through those steps. Again, getting some information about their rights, usually generating some sort of document they can use as a starting point, even if it's a letter or the framework for a letter that they can send to their landlord or to potentially their HR team or to a relevant employment tribunal to get the process they need to be involved in started. and then connected them to other resources from there afterwards. But very similar in feel to a large language model, but very tuned for legal, both from a workflow point of view, but also from a legal accuracy and reliability point of view.
Yeah, it sounds like a great hybrid of, like you said, kind of an interface that consumers have come to get used to over the past few years, but then also paired with like the right legal resources. That kind of leads me into my next question around trust, which is so important for especially building in like the consumer category. And like you mentioned, the issues that you're helping people with are often very high stakes. So how do you think about accuracy and reliability? Do you involve the human lawyers in this process at all? Would love to just hear your perspective on that.
For sure. So there are a few different parts that we really think about. One is on the product side, we've invested a lot of engineering and product effort into an accuracy and evaluation framework that we use to test how current and effective the software is at handling legal areas that we cover really regularly. Again, those being most heavily housing, employment law, family law as well. And so we have a data set and a training process, or a testing process, excuse me, we use internally to evaluate performance in those areas. The other big piece is around how we actually communicate that accuracy and reliability to new customers, because when someone comes to the site, they have no way of knowing that behind the scenes there's all this effort going into trust. And so we've focused a lot of the earlier part of the Contend experience, to the extent possible, being around getting users to an aha moment where they realize they're not just speaking with an untrained or really narrowly specific chatbot that you'd find on some other site. It asks clarifying questions, but also provides context and information that makes them feel as if the early information they're providing is heard and understood, and gets them to the point where they can keep chatting back and forth more meaningfully really quickly. The faster we can get people engaged and actually bought into providing more context to the system in order to get them to that plan, the more likely it is that they stay on the process. So behind the scenes, to summarize it, behind the scenes, there's a lot of work on accuracy and evaluation. For the actual user themselves, we get them to an aha moment really quickly. And then there's a third element there, which is around marketing and emphasizing positive reviews from sources like Trustpilot, emphasizing user success stories in similar areas and more. So a few different avenues there.
Yeah, it sounds like you've thought a lot about this, which is good to hear. I think one super interesting point that you just mentioned around making users feel heard and understood, I think that kind of crosses whether you're using a human lawyer or not, right? People with serious legal issues want to make sure they're being heard. And so the ways that you can kind of tackle that with technology is great. I'm curious, you started this kind of in the England and Wales territory where you didn't actually have roots in when you first got started. Why did you choose that market, and what did it take to build credibility kind of either with the users and sort of the regulatory side of things?
For sure. I've got a North American accent, and I'm in fact North American, based in Canada. And so why the UK? There are a couple of reasons why. One, and the most important one, is from a regulatory posture point of view. England and Wales, but the United Kingdom more broadly, is less aggressive with how it's enforced human lawyers providing legal advice versus non-lawyers or other professionals than other jurisdictions. So compared to the United States, compared to Canada, or a lot of other English-speaking jurisdictions. And so as an early stage company that already has a lot of battles to win when you're figuring out product market fit, figuring out how you're going to do distribution and more, we wanted to choose the lowest risk market from a regulatory risk point of view. And so even on balance, when you factor in different time zone, cultural differences, potentially challenges with marketing if we were going to be doing any things in person, we still decided that England and Wales was the right starting point. And a lot of our early go-to-market, both things we tried and things that were eventually successful, were very digital oriented. I guess that's part of the reality of being a 21st century company, is that you don't need to physically be somewhere to effectively provide or sell a product or service in that area. So the regulatory environment was one of the major starting points. It's also an enormous market as well, where England and Wales is actually the largest population of English-speaking people under a single legal system. And that's larger than any individual Canadian province or territory or any individual state in the US. So a great starting point that allows us to generalize what we're doing from a product point of view to other markets when we get it right.
And how are you thinking about expanding beyond the UK?
So the US is the next logical expansion point, similar language or identical language, different legal systems, but the building blocks around what the product would need to do from a planning and an individual steps point of view is close enough that a lot of that would generalize. Distribution would also need to be different, but realistically, it would be the largest states in the US as a starting point. And there is some really good precedent for companies that have had success providing services that maybe challenge the paradigms around who should or shouldn't be providing legal services like legal advice. So LegalZoom is a really great example of a company that pushed boundaries in California and a bunch of other states as well, providing accessible and affordable legal help via documents and other services in a market that was historically dominated by lawyers. And so there's a playbook there that we would be looking to replicate and use as how we actually push into that market. But a huge part of this is getting it right in one market first. And as, again, a small company with a limited amount of resources that you have to use judiciously, we don't want to expand horizontally too quickly when there's a lot to figure out in the primary market first.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And I know you kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but if we dig in a little bit more, what about AI and large language models specifically makes you think that the access to justice problem is more solvable now than it was maybe a couple of years ago?
For sure. And to situate my mental model on this a little more clearly, big picture, I think there were actually three issues that, and some of them are still more present than others, that made consumer grade legal technology really effective. So one of them is the technology. I don't think it was robust and versatile enough historically to be able to solve a wide range of legal issues. That's the biggest thing that large language models have solved. Regulatory concerns are another big one, which we already spoke about. And then the third one, which we may talk about as well on this, is around distribution. I think distributing software effectively in a consumer context, obviously consumer B2C type go-to-market is already very difficult, but it's especially hard in legal. To come back to the technology piece, though, which I think was one of the biggest components that was improved in a game-changing way with the advent and the rapid development of large language models. The technology is so robust and versatile in a way that it wasn't before. And it's so exciting to see it work either when you're using it in your own contexts for either personal or professional reasons, but even with Contend, it's able to deal with a wide range of queries and questions from users in a wide range of areas that allow people to communicate about their legal issue in a plain English way, which historically was not easy to do. You'd be forced into some sort of either decision tree or some sort of clicking through and trying to figure out things as you go, or you're just left on your own without a solution. And that versatility and robustness that large language models afford make the whole process far more achievable than it would have been even 3 years ago. So that's the biggest change. And it makes a lot of accessing the service for an uninitiated or uneducated user a lot more frictionless.
Yeah, I think that I totally agree on the robustness and being a little bit more dynamic than those decision trees, but also, like you said, the plain English, like that was one of the biggest barriers, is most everyday people not understanding like legalese to like effectively communicate their issues too. So definitely agree with you there. And you kind of alluded to it, definitely also want to cover sort of the distribution angle. Most legal tech investment to date has certainly gone more towards companies focused on the B2B motion, and you're building B2C. So curious how you think about that distribution and what's worked for you and how you see that scaling.
For sure. It's interesting because I think B2C legal tech and B2B legal tech may have more different than they do in common in many ways. The users are very different. Customers are very different. And even though there's some pieces of overlap between the use cases around maybe needing documents or needing a specific type of information, either summarized or relayed in a productive way, it's a very different workflow profile than what the professional services or B2B world is looking for when you compare it against the consumer market. So early days with Contend, we experimented with a lot of different ways of getting the software into the hands of as many people as possible. Even when it was an early prototype, we caveated that appropriately and just wanted to see how people would engage with and use the software and try to find a pathway to getting it into people's hands in a cost-effective way. We tried paid ads, which are very cost prohibitive unless you have extremely specific and well-defined targeting. So that wasn't a good channel for us early. We did a lot of work on different social platforms. So I managed to get myself banned on a lot of different Facebook and Reddit communities as I was just reaching out to as many people as I possibly could. But what eventually led to a lot of success for us was posting organic content that, and by organic, I mean something that pulls in people who are searching for particular terms on Google, or eventually, now more recently, large language models that lined up well with the use cases we were serving. So for us, that was a lot of content around housing, employment law, a few other miscellaneous legal areas as well. So we have this large category called courts and procedures that pull in people who are looking for very specific questions around moving court dates or particular vacation policy connections to what they're looking to do with a case they have in court and other questions like that. And by finding a lot of what people were searching for using a lot of search engine optimization, SEO tools, we were able to create large volumes of content that targeted those people really effectively. And so finding that high volume, low customer acquisition cost channel was a really helpful starting point for us. And it's given us a strong foundation to see a really heavy flow of users coming in and how they actually engage with the platform, and also allows us to learn a lot more about what they're chatting to Contend about and what they're actually looking to solve with their legal issues. And so that was our first big breakthrough on the go-to-market side. But in consumer, especially when the ticket price can't always be very high for the service you're selling, getting the unit economics right and finding a model that is long-term sustainable is a lot more challenging when compared to selling to a law firm where they can afford to spend tens, if not hundreds, or maybe even millions of dollars per year, relative to a user who can only spend a much smaller amount and on a defined time scale as well.
Right. And I think the customer acquisition cost being optimized is certainly like one piece of that, like what you're describing with the go-to-market. Curious the other side of that, how you're thinking about pricing. Like you said, it can't always be the highest ticket price. And on top of that, the market that you're building in, your customers kind of need this, especially in like very intense situations. Like people who need it the most are sometimes like least likely to be able to afford those high prices. So thinking about the other side of the equation on pricing, curious your perspective on that.
For sure. So our view is that there's a lot of, first of all, overlap in terms of use case between the really price sensitive users and people that are in the, broadly speaking, the consumer mid-market, people who are not extremely price sensitive, can afford to pay some amount of money and are looking to get to an effective, accurate outcome and are willing to do that, but are too price sensitive to want to afford a lawyer. And so targeting that middle group or building for that middle group, which also allows us to implicitly build a solution that addresses a lot of the really high cost sensitive needs, is what we've been focused on. And especially recently, a lot of our testing on the product and go-to-market side over the last few months has focused particularly on different pricing models that in some cases are modeled after similar businesses in other sectors. In other cases are modeled after companies doing something similar to us in legal. So other either legal or legal adjacent services. And then also focusing that in on particular use cases too. So right now we're very focused on housing law in particular on the consumer side. But the short answer to your question is people who are extremely cost sensitive and may not have very much money to pay for legal services don't fundamentally have enormously different issues from people who have more money to spend on some of these. That's not always the case across every legal issue, but in housing, employment law, a lot of the areas that we cover, there's a lot of overlap and consistency between the really cost sensitive and those who don't necessarily have the means, and people who have some amount of money but don't necessarily want to engage with a human lawyer. As far as the actual mechanics of the different pricing models, we've experimented with one-off payments that essentially give users access for a defined period of time. Right now, we're heavily leaning on subscriptions as the default and seeing what sort of churn we see, if any, and then also what sort of different price points and changes in upfront pricing model, what those do to engagement early on in the funnel. But results on those tests still forthcoming, so excited to see the data on that.
Kind of like everything else in terms of being a founder, lots of testing and learning, right?
Yeah, constantly.
Before we jump here, I would love to hear where you see the consumer legal AI category going in the next few years, and also if you have any advice for others who might be building in the space.
I'll answer the second part of that question first, because I think it's tied into what we were just talking about. I think getting distribution right is not only the most important piece, but also the hardest piece. I think what you're able to do with technology now and the speed at which you can build a product from 0 to 1 now is much, much, much faster than it was before. And being a company that does well, and even more so than does well, that actually wins in the space, requires having differentiated and sustainable and solid distribution, which in a consumer context where buyers have less inertia than large law firms or large in-house legal teams, getting an edge that is sustainable over a long period of time as a competitive advantage is really hard. So figuring out your distribution early is the piece of advice I would give as a founder who has gone through it if I were to be building from 0 to 1 in the space again. In terms of what I think the landscape will look like in several years, I think there's going to be continued growth with companies that are building for specific workflows really well and integrating in with existing processes really well. Because what we're trying to do, and there are other companies who have different views on the best way to do this as well, is bridge the gap between a really powerful foundational technology in the form of large language models and the actual problems that people are aiming to solve in an antiquated and highly bureaucratic system, the legal system. And so some companies are more focused on human in the loop and how AI can augment that process. And so the product they're offering is highly human driven in terms of the services element, but the lawyers that are supporting the consumers have a lot of AI supported technology. We're much more on the pure AI side of this. How much technology can we provide to the end user without having to involve a human? And so as time goes on, if we fast forward 2-3 years, there will be a lot more maturity with companies that have figured out the best way to take large language models and fit them into existing workflows. A lot of that learning and experimentation that we talked about will have happened. And there'll be a combination of better articulated products, but also go-to-market motions and businesses that are at a scale where they're just more mature. They figured out more about the product and they figured out more about the distribution. But I think it'll be specialized for particular workflows in an intelligent way. If a company is extremely successful, there's the opportunity to build a brand and a unified company that tackles a variety of different workflows and is trusted in a wide variety of areas. I think that's the holy grail for a company building in consumers. If you have a brand across many legal areas that's trusted, has a lot of consumer confidence, does really well on the trust element we mentioned earlier, and goes from there. Right now, it's a fragmented market. A company that can accomplish that would be the biggest winner in the space.
Yeah, I kind of like that as a big vision in terms of building like a big brand in consumer legal. But I also think to your other point, one thing that we talk a lot about at the fund too is it easier in consumer legal at least to just embed it into the everyday lives of consumers, right? Like building in things that they're already used to, and maybe like partnerships could be interesting there as well. Just because the legal issues faced by consumers are not totally every day. And so tucking it in like a seamless experience could be interesting too. So it'll be interesting to see what actually happens in the next few years. But really appreciate your time and perspective. Thank you so much for joining us in studio. Looking forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks for having me, Casey.